read aloud the Indian Economic Development textbook for class 11. I have finished chapter 1, that is Development Policies and Experience, that is Indian Economy on the Eve of Independence. And the second chapter I finished up till Industry and Trade, that is Indian Economy 1950 to 1990. So I finished with the goals of the 5-year plans, the long-term goals, that is, because every 5-year plan has a short-term goal. They have a few, each plan has a few short-term goals too, which have not been described here. We've done agriculture, we've done industry. I have read aloud industry and trade, and in this I'm going to do trade policy, import substitution. Trade policy, import substitution. The industrial policy that we adopted was closely related to the trade policy. In the first 7 plans, trade was characterized by what is commonly called an inward-looking trade strategy. Technically, this strategy is called import substitution. This policy aimed at replacing or substituting imports with domestic production. For example, instead of importing vehicles made in a foreign country, industries would be encouraged to produce them in India itself. In this policy, the government protected the domestic industries from foreign competition. Protection from imports took 2 forms. One, tariffs, and the second was quotas. Tariffs are a tax on imported goods. They make imported goods more expensive and discourages their use. Quotas specify the quantity of goods which can be imported. This effect of tariffs and quotas is that they restrict imports and therefore protect the domestic firms from foreign competition. The policy of protection is based on the notion that industries in developing countries are not in a position to compete against the goods produced by more developed economies. It is assumed that if the domestic industries are protected, they will learn to compete in the course of time. Our planners also feared the possibility of foreign exchange being spent on import of luxury goods if no restrictions were placed on imports. Nor was any serious thought given to promoting exports until the mid-1980s. Subheading now, effect of the policies that we have just studied on industrial development. The achievement of India's industrial sector during the first 7 plans are impressive indeed. The proportion of GDP contributed by the industrial sector increased in the period from 11.8% in 1950-51 to 24.6% in 1990-91. The rise in the industrial share of the GDP is an important indicator of development. The 6% annual growth rate of the industrial sector during the period is commendable. No longer was Indian industry restricted largely to cotton, textiles, and jute. In fact, the industrial sector became well diversified in 1990, largely due to the public sector. The promotion of small-scale industries gave opportunities to those people who did not have the capital to start large firms to get into business. Protection from foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industries in the areas of electronics and automobile sectors which otherwise would not have developed. In spite of the contribution made by the public sector to the growth of the Indian economy, some economists are critical of the performance of the many public sector enterprises. It was proposed at the beginning of this chapter that initially public sector was required in a big way. It is now widely held that the state enterprises continued to produce certain goods and services, often monopolizing them, although this was no longer required. An example is the provision of telecommunications service. This industry continued to be reserved for the public sector even after it was realized that the private sector firms could also provide it. Due to the absence of competition, even till the late 1990s, one had to wait for a long time to get a telephone connection. Another instance could be the establishment of modern bread, a bread manufacturing firm as if the private sector could not manufacture bread. In 2001, this firm was sold to the private sector. The point is that after 4 decades of planned development of Indian economy, no distinction was made between 1. What the public sector alone can do, and 2. What the private sector can also do. For example, even now only the public sector supplies national defense, and even though the private sector can manage hotels well, yet the government also runs hotels. This has led some scholars to argue that the state should get out of the areas which the private sector can manage, and the government may concentrate its resources on important services which the private sector cannot provide. Many public sector firms incurred huge losses but continued to function because it's difficult to close a government undertaking even if it is a drain on the nation's limited resources. This doesn't mean that the private firms are always profitable. Indeed, quite a few of the public sector firms were originally private firms which were on the verge of closure due to losses. They were then nationalized to protect the jobs of the workers. However, a loss-making private firm will not waste resources by being kept running despite the losses. The need to obtain a license to start an industry was misused by the industrial houses. A big industrialist would get a license not for starting a new firm but to prevent competitors from starting new firms. The excessive regulation, or what came to be called the permit license Raj, prevented certain firms from becoming more efficient. More time was spent by industrialists in trying to obtain a license or lobby with the concerned ministries rather than on thinking about how to improve their products. The protection from foreign competition is also being criticized on the ground that it continued even after it proved to do more harm than good. Due to restrictions on imports, the Indian consumers had to purchase whatever the Indian producers produced. The producers were aware that they had a captive market, so they had no incentive to improve the quality of their goods. Why should they think of improving quality when they could sell low quality items at a high price? Competition from imports forces our producers to be more efficient. A good thing. A few economists also point out that the public sector is not meant for earning profits but to promote the welfare of the nation. The public sector firms, on this view, should be evaluated on the basis of the extent to which they contribute to the welfare of the people and not on the profits they earn. Regarding protection, some economists hold that they should protect our producers from foreign competition as long as the rich nations continue to do so. Owing to all these conflicts, economists call for a change in our policy. This, along with other problems, led the government to introduce a new economic policy in 1991. So, in conclusion, the progress of the Indian economy during the first 7 plans was impressive indeed. Our industries became far more diversified compared to the situation at independence. India became self-sufficient in food production thanks to the Green Revolution. Land reform resulted in abolition of the hated zamindari system. However, many economists became dissatisfied with the performance of many public sector enterprises. Excessive government regulation prevented growth of entrepreneurship. In the name of self-reliance, our producers were protected against foreign competition, and this did not give them the incentive to improve the quality of goods that they produced. Our policies were inward-oriented, and so we failed to develop a strong export sector. The need for reform of economic policy was widely felt in the context of changing global economic scenario, and the new economic policy was initiated in 1991 to make our economy more efficient. This is the subject of the next chapter. Now let's look at this table. It shows the sectoral contribution to GDP and discusses the difference in the contribution of the sectors in the light of the effects of developing during 1950 to 91. So this is the agriculture sector. 1950-51 contribution to GDP was 59.0%. In 1990-91 it came down to 34.9%. Industry, it was 13 in 1950-51, close to independence, and it rose to 24.6 when we just before the new economic policy, 1991. And here services, you see it was 28%, it contributed 28% to the GDP, and it has arisen to 40.5. Pretty impressive. So here's one of another numbered box which are given in all the chapters. These boxes supplement the information given in the text. However, these boxes are not for any evaluation or examination, but very interesting because right now we just read about the GDP contribution by the three sectors, and we saw that the service sector definitely has done better. So I'm just going to read a little from here. It's box number 2.4. So when you open your books, you can see that. As a country develops, it undergoes structural change. See the word structural change. In the case of India, the structural change is peculiar. Usually, with development, the share of agriculture declines and the share of industry becomes dominant. At higher levels of development, the service sector contributes more to the GDP than the other two sectors. In India, the share of agriculture in GDP was more than 50%, as we would expect for a poor country. But by 1990, the share of the service sector was 40.59%, more than that of agriculture or industry, like what we find in developed nations. This phenomenon of growing share of the service sector was accelerated in the post-1991 period. This marked the onset of globalization in the country, which will be discussed in the subsequent chapters. This is a photo of Mahala Nobis, the architect of Indian planning. This is in box number 2.3. So this box gives us an added information about Mahala Nobis, the architect of Indian planning. Many distinguished thinkers contributed to the formulation of our 5-year plans. Among them, the name of the statistician Prasanta Chandra Mahala Nobis stands out. Planning, in the real sense of the term, began with the second 5-year plan. The second plan, a landmark contribution to development planning in general, laid down the basic ideas regarding goals of Indian planning. This plan was based on the ideas of Mahala Nobis. In that sense, he can be regarded as the architect of Indian planning. Mahala Nobis was born in 1893 in Calcutta. He was educated at the Presidency College in Calcutta and at Cambridge University in England. His contributions to the subject of statistics brought him international fame. In 1946, he was made a fellow, that is, member of Britain's Royal Society, one of the most prestigious organizations of scientists. Only the most outstanding scientists are made members of this society. Mahala Nobis established the Indian Statistical Institute, ISI, in Calcutta and started a journal, Sankhya, which still serves as a respected forum for statisticians to discuss their ideas. Both the ISI and Sankhya are highly regarded by the statisticians and economists all over the world to this day. During the second plan period, Mahala Nobis invited many distinguished economists from India and abroad to advise him on India's economic development. Some of these economists became Nobel Prize winners later, which shows that he could identify individuals with talent. Among the economists invited by Mahala Nobis were those who were very critical on the socialist principles of the second plan. In other words, he was willing to listen to what his critics had to say, the mark of a great scholar. Many economists today reject the approach of planning formulated by Mahala Nobis, but he will always be remembered for playing a vital role in putting India on the road to economic progress, and statisticians continue to profit from his contribution to statistical theory. So the source, they say, is Sukhmoy Chakrabarti, Mahala Nobis, Prasanta Chandra in John E12 et al., the New Palgrave Dictionary, Economic Development. So this is what is written. So another box in chapter 2, the first box, the types of economic systems. Remember, we talked about the capitalistic, the socialist, and the mixed economy. So every society has to answer 3 questions. What goods and services should be produced in the country? Second, how should the goods and services be produced? Should producers use more human labor or more capital, that is machines, for producing things? And third, how should the goods and services be distributed among people? One answer to these questions is to depend on the market forces of supply and demand. In a market economy, also called capitalism, only those consumer goods will be produced that are in demand. For example, goods that can be sold profitably either in the domestic or in the foreign markets. If cars are in demand, cars will be produced. And if bicycles are in demand, bicycles will be produced. If labor is cheaper than capital, more labor-intensive methods of production will be used, and vice versa. In a capitalist society, the goods produced are distributed among people not on the basis of what people need, but on the basis of purchasing power. The ability to buy goods and services, that is, one has to have the money in the pocket to buy it. Low-cost housing for the poor is much needed, but will not count as demand in the market sense because the poor do not have the purchasing power to back the demand. As a result, this commodity will not be produced and supplied as per market forces. Such a society did not appeal to Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, for it meant that the great majority of people of the country would be left behind without the chance to improve their quality of life. A socialist society answers the 3 questions in a totally different manner. In a socialist society, the government decides what goods are to be produced in accordance with the needs of society. It is assumed that the government knows what is good for the people of the country, and so the desires of the individual consumers are not given much importance. The government decides how goods are to be produced and how they should be distributed. In principle, distribution under socialism is supposed to be based on what the people need and not on what they can afford to purchase, unlike under capitalism. For example, a socialist nation provides free health care to all its citizens. Strictly, a socialist society has no private property since everything is owned by the state. In Cuba and China, for example, most of the economic activities are governed by the socialist principles. Most economies are mixed economies. That is, the government and the market together answer the 3 questions of what to produce, how to produce, and how to distribute what is produced. In a mixed economy, the market will provide whatever goods and services it can produce well, and the government will provide essential goods and services which the market fails to do.